So let's get to the next thing you want to know.
Platform crossover, building a following, especially when you're now talking about we're trying to build a podcast, but we're also trying to build a social following. We're just not sure what the crossover is going to be, or if those are just separate bills. Like, how do you
Mhm.
view launching a podcast? Do we just try to find podcast listeners where they are? Or do we try to convert followers and vice versa?
Okay, so let's start with this. And we touched on it a little bit, but what's your goal? Why are you doing a podcast at all? What do you ultimately want to have happen?
We want to own the friendship space. We want to go on tour. We want to sell ads against it. We want to Patreon. We want to help people reconnect with their friends. We have a social and financial goal.
Right.
But we're looking for audience. Your number one goal are subscribers.
Okay, but so the goal is to build this as there's always overlap, right? So the more successful this becomes as an entity, the better it is for each of you guys in your individual careers and as comic and whatever, and vice versa. The more success you have individually, the better it is for this show. But you're clearly viewing this as its own entity. It's not just like, oh, this is just a sort of Trojan horse to get people to know us so we can go tour individually or whatever, right? You're building a thing here. Okay. So a couple of thoughts here. So let me talk about kind of social media relationship to podcast and downloads and all that, right? So first of all, social media absolutely can work to drive listeners to your podcast. So I do think that you should obviously be using it. I don't think it's just a side thing. But the key is, I think, to think about it differently and not get hung up on download numbers and where those listens happens. So at the end of the day, especially if you're trying to build this into a thing, it's about consumption. And it doesn't really matter if someone listens on Apple Podcasts or listens to a clip on Instagram. Initially, this would be my mindset. I understand that ultimately, if you're trying to monetize, download numbers matter with ads and blah, blah, blah. But initially, you're just trying to get as many people as possible to consume this stuff. So where a lot of people go wrong is they're just sharing links to their episodes on social media. They're constantly trying to drive people to downloads or YouTube videos or whatever. I think that your goal is not to get downloads. It's to get your content consumed. If your content is consumed and people like it, then you're going to be building relationships, which ultimately leads to downloads and live shows and a million other things, right? So you don't want to think of social as promotional channels for the show. You want to think of them as content channels that are extensions of the show. And I'm talking about right now, each of your individual channels. We can have a separate conversation about whether the show should have its own account or whatever. But regardless, the approach is the same. So I actually think in my mind, and this is going to be weird to say, but your podcast isn't a podcast. Your podcast is a collection of content and ideas. And the quote unquote podcast is just one distribution platform for what you're creating. So whatever you're doing when you guys sit down and record an episode, you're doing that knowing that you're ultimately going to be chopping it up in all the ways that fit the different platforms that you choose to use. And I would even think about as you get into the episodes, and I don't know your specific format or whatever, but be thinking about it specifically. A lot of times you'll see people do a podcast and they just start recording and they have some rambling conversation that goes wherever, as opposed to a TV show that is very segmented. My podcast very specifically is 3 questions. It's super easy to chop up, right? So for example, the podcast that we're recording right now, we're going to sit and we're going to talk for 45 minutes or whatever this is going to be. That whole full 45 minutes will be available in audio on Spotify and Apple and all that. The full thing will be available on YouTube. There will have to be 3 different videos of each of your individual questions available on YouTube, each titled based on that topic, right? So almost treating them as if they're separate content. There'll also be short highlight clips on Twitter and LinkedIn, which is what I use. I don't use the other stuff, but if I did, TikTok, Instagram, whatever, stuff I say or you say will be turned into tweets, social posts, maybe even blog posts. It might be repurposed with other episodes I do that relate to podcasts. And just here's a bunch of podcast tips. Plus a bunch of this stuff will wind up on my newsletter. Some may wind up in products I sell. So while this is a podcast that I'm doing, I just think of it as a way to capture and create content that then's going everywhere. And I don't really, yeah, I'd love to have people download it and listen to it, whatever. But my main goal is I want them to see it, consume it, connect to it, share it, whatever. And by the way, the other thing I should say with my podcast, the number one driver of downloads and views on YouTube to my podcast by far is my newsletter, right? Now, I have a lot of subscribers, but to the point of can social and can this stuff drive views and downloads, it certainly can. To be honest with you, I have no idea. Launching this without that, I think would be such a struggle to get people to pay attention. You guys have email lists and you guys have whatever, and it doesn't matter if they're huge or not. But I think you can definitely leverage people to go and consume that content. I can't track it specifically, but I would assume that my newsletter is also the main driver of subscribers, not just listens. The other thing I would say that I've found, I get more views of this podcast on YouTube than I do audio downloads, which I also, and I know you guys are going to do YouTube for your show as well. That's been interesting and has surprised me a little bit, but I think it speaks to when you're creating, keeping that in mind and understanding that like, hey, this is a terrible example, right? But you might go, we're always going to have a segment that's the 60-second friendship tip. And you're doing that because this is going to work well on TikTok or YouTube or whatever, keeping in mind that like creating a show that you know is designed to go multiple places is ultimately how I think I would approach it.
Because we actually have started to do that. We actually, now that we record, our first 15 minutes every time we record is purely topical stuff that isn't even going to be on the podcast that we're left putting up on the TikTok. And
Cool.
You're the second person to now tell us we should come up with like 60-second kit type thing that should just be purely for social.
Yeah. And or even just recurring segments. And also as you go, you're going to learn like some of it'll happen organically, right? You're going to figure out like, oh, people really responded to when we did that thing, or we had that conversation, or when Aaron admitted this embarrassing friendship moment or whatever, that really clicked. We should do more of that. So you'll find it as you go. And then the other thing I would talk about just quickly with social, because everyone struggles with this. Should the show have its own separate account or not, or just be your guys' accounts? In general, I'm hesitant to say start separate accounts because I think it adds a lot of work without a lot of reward certainly in the beginning. And it's not that you shouldn't do it, but I think it can get very confusing because the truth is anything you guys would post, you're probably going to post on your personal accounts also, or in some version of it. It depends. It's not bad if you don't mind doing the work or you have somebody doing the work for you, like sure, why not? So I'm not against it. The only reason I warn people about it is because I think it just adds a lot of work. You guys know how much work it is to manage your own individual accounts. Doing another one adds work. But again, if you have help and you can manage it, like that's the whole Gary Vaynerchuk thing, right? Like people like him, right? They look at him and they go, Gary's everywhere and he posts a million things. Gary's probably got a team of 20 people working on that stuff. But then you see people trying to mimic what those people are doing and they're doing it themselves. And you're going to drown, right? So if you can take it on and you have help, sure, why not? But if you don't, I wouldn't. A lot of people feel like they have to do it. And I don't know that you have to do it. Cool.